Hi, welcome back. We're going to continue our talk on Angelika Kauffmann. In part 2, we're going to look primarily at her history paintings that she does while she's in Italy. In the first part, we looked at her early training, her aspirations as both a musician and an artist, her early travels in Italy before moving up to England. There, she meets the likes of Sir Joshua Reynolds, forms many important relationships and patrons, she joins the Royal Academy as a founding member, and then finally, we ended part 1 as she left England to return to Italy in 1781, newly married to Antonio Zucchi. A reflection of how truly internationally recognized she was, when Kauffman returns to Italy, she's offered a position as a court painter for the King of Naples. We see here a portrait that she does of the royal family, but ultimately she declines this position. This was not what she left England for. She returned to Italy to set up her own studio and become a history painter. Painted in 1785, Cornelia presenting her children as treasures is probably the best known history painting by Angelika Kauffmann today. In this, we can see primary characteristics of the neoclassical style, both in the subject, in other words, the story it's telling, and its underlying messages, but also in the style of the composition. So let's take a look at each of these. First, let's tell the story. Even without knowing who Cornelia was, we can get an idea of the message that Angelika Kauffmann is portraying in this image. We see two women, one with children, one with jewels, or treasures. So right away we get the moral message of the painting. The one woman prizes her children, the other woman prizes material wealth. The story takes on added meaning when we understand who Cornelia was. She was a figure from ancient Rome, and those two boys on her right grow up to be very important people. They are the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, and they were seen as great reformers at a period when the Republic had been growing corrupt. They attempted to pass many laws of reform, and ultimately both died for those beliefs. In this painting, Kauffman is creating a connection between the good mother of Cornelia and the moral character of her sons as they grow into men. And this is also typical of Kauffman's career. When she does history paintings, we find a greater number of those paintings tell the story of the women from ancient Rome, Greek mythology, from their point of view. So she puts a twist on history painting by telling familiar stories, but from a woman's perspective. There are some very specific things that Kauffman does in terms of the composition. Look at how limited the number of characters are. There's not a lot of extraneous people. We don't see a crowded street and in the middle of the street see this event. We see a very limited scene. We only have the number of figures needed in order to tell the story. Cornelia and her children, the other woman and her jewels. We're in a very stage-like setting. All of the activity takes place on a very narrow piece of the foreground. It's almost like there's a backdrop behind them. And this idea of a shallow, stage-like setting where the main action takes place is pretty characteristic of the neoclassical style. Now, Kauffman, in terms of her figures, does tend to have a softer style than some of the neoclassical artists that we will see. If you look at the edges of the figures, it's almost like it's been airbrushed. There is a certain softness to it. It doesn't have the hard, linear style that we see in Jacques-Louis David. And we think back to her training and her development during the period of the Rococo. She retains an element of this softness throughout her career. And in fact, some critics of her time and since have criticized her style for this very reason. But it also becomes one of those key elements that sets her apart from the other history painters of her day. One of the ways that you could recognize her paintings against, say, Benjamin West or Jacques-Louis David. It's her specific approach to form. Therefore, we find that in addition to the general elements associated with neoclassical history painting, such as classical stories set in a classical stage-like setting with, you guessed it, classical attire, kind of a generalized Romanish, toga-ish attire, this painting also exemplifies Kauffman's personal style, her muted color palette, and emphasis on beautiful and harmonic compositions, that soft edge. Contrast the contour line of her figures with that of Jacques-Louis David, and you can really see a distinct difference. This painting had been commissioned from Kauffman by George Bowles, who was a patron of art from London, so he already knew her work, and he was also staying with the King of Naples while she was there. She then made a second version of this painting for the Queen of Naples, A third version of this painting with a slightly different setup was created for the nephew of the King of Poland in 1788. This is not uncommon for an artist to become popular for depicting certain scenes and then repeating those scenes for different patrons. This happened in the Renaissance, the Baroque, the Rococo, and now it's happening in the Neoclassical period. What's interesting about the third painting is that not only is the composition pretty different than the other two, but that this one was paired with another painting, and it was a painting that was quite different from what Kauffman usually portrayed. It was paired with a scene of Brutus condemning his sons to death. You will see a painting similar to this in the online lecture on Jacques-Louis David in the years of the French Revolution. For Kauffman, it was really unusual for her to portray a scene without any women, and that's what we see here. So it helps to remember that this painting was not conceived of in isolation, but it was conceived as a pairing with Cornelia. So we have Brutus the father, who is condemning his sons to death for the greater good of the state, and we have the sacrifice of Cornelia the mother, who sacrifices for her children, and then they end up sacrificing themselves for the greater good of the state. And for both of these stories, that state was the Roman Republic. And in the time of the French Revolution, when a monarchy is about to be overthrown for a republic, or at least that was one of the goals, there is a lot of added allegorical meaning for these ancient stories in their modern times. So the story here is not simply parenthood or the good mother or the brutal father, but the decisions that a parent makes and how those decisions ultimately affect the greater good of society. So neoclassical. So one more painting before we go, but it's important to remember we're really seeing a small slice of all of the paintings that Kauffman created, literally hundreds of portraits and narrative history paintings over her long career. But before we go, let's go back and look at this theme which we addressed in her earliest painting, and that is the artist as both painter and musician. In 1751, at the age of 50, Angelika Kauffmann painted the self-portrait hesitating between the arts of music and painting, looking back at this pivotal choice that she had made much earlier, at about 16 or 17 years of age, around the year of the death of her mother in 1757. Look closely at these two allegorical figures which represent music and painting. What do you notice about the paths they offer? Does one look easier? Does one look more difficult? What does that suggest about the life ahead each choice offers? When I look at this painting, it really seems to me like she's already made up her mind. She's clutching the hand of music, but she's indicating that her mind is made up. She's chosen painting. And despite the harshness of this path, indicated by the rocky climb, there's that glorious temple up at the top. Can she make it? Can she reach that objective? That's the life she's choosing. That's her goal, and as we know today, and as she knew in 1791, she had achieved it. This painting is sometimes compared to the Choice of Hercules by the famous Baroque artist Annibale Carracci. And it's an interesting comparison, and you definitely can see a relationship between the figure of painting and the figure of virtue, because what we really have in Carracci's painting is Hercules deciding between vice, represented by the scantily clad female with the translucent robe, and then the figure of virtue, who, like the figure of painting, is pointing to a rocky path. But it's worth noting before we conclude that it was pretty bold of Kauffman to equate painting, her choice to be a professional painter, with that of Hercules' choice to accept virtue, because the two were not necessarily synonymous in the 18th or 19th or 20th century. Her achievements, like that of Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, were really quite extraordinary, not only to achieve such status as an artist, but to achieve such status as a woman artist, with all of the additional obstacles they faced. And as we'll see going forward, many of these obstacles remain quite in place for quite some time to come.